My name is Ellie Ade-Kur, and I work with the board of directors at Maggie's Toronto Sex Workers Action Project. And you're at our vaccine clinic. Like as soon as you say intersectionality, I'm like, okay, like let's have a conversation about this. One thing that happens even within populations of like exotic dancers and at clubs is like you can be a dancer, you can work in spaces. To be a Black dancer though, working in clubs in Toronto can be especially difficult because of how rampant anti-Blackness in this sector is from a lot of clubs, including the space that we're in right now, and under a lot of circumstances. And so what anti-Blackness looks like in these contexts, like we could just go through the laundry list right now. Like a lot of clubs like have like a Black dancer quota, and like you go to the door and like you can just be told, it's very common for a lot of dancers to be told like, we have girls that look like you already, we have enough of you already, like come back later. Because club owners and managers and often people screening the dancers at the front are often like very cognizant of like what they think will sell. And it's a very cis, a very white, a very like hetero, like patriarchal idea of like what beauty really is, and something that's not really consistent with like concepts of intersectionality. So at Maggie's, to kind of like address some of that, and also some of the other pieces like wear a wig, take your braids down, don't have natural hair, use heavy makeup, change your name. If you have an accent, get rid of that. Don't dance to urban music. So a lot of things that like white and non-Black entertainers are able to like do, and not just do, but benefit off of. Like I'm talking about like that Kardashian cultural appropriation, like benefiting off of those aesthetics, while Black dancers in these same spaces are then told, no, like we can't have you here because you look the way you do, which is really frustrating. So at Maggie's, we started a club called the Strap House, just for the pandemic. So we're gonna see what happens when we transition back into IRL kind of events, but like the Strap House is like a queer Black virtual club. And we've featured like Black dancers, queer dancers, trans dancers. It's a whole other conversation about what kind of dancers allowed to operate in this kind of space. And it's been really nice to kind of feature like our own community members on their terms, like their look, their show, their music, like they really call the shots, and it's a beautiful space. I can't think of the last time, especially in the context of sex work in Toronto, there's even been a space that really like celebrates Black sex workers, period. Like even internally within work at Maggie's, I love Maggie's, I've been here for 5 years, but even within the context of like sex worker justice work, there's definitely a long way to go in terms of like even talking about anti-Black racism, period. And kind of like chipping away at some of the liberal politics of like, we're all sex workers, we're all here, but we're not all impacted by criminalization in the same way. And so I think the Strap House, but also things like our Black Sex Worker Emergency Support Fund, like these are ways to kind of start that conversation around how anti-Black racism like operates like within our communities, but also within our movement too. There are some like slight changes in like how sex work happens for some communities, but at Maggie's, I think one thing we're seeing is like street-based sex workers, people doing full service sex work in person, have largely still been pushed to continue doing that work. The only thing that's really changed is the political climate, the economic conditions, and the demand as well, that I think a lot of people have really had to adapt to, whether that means like negotiating boundaries, negotiating pricing, and things like that. So in many ways, the work hasn't changed, but what we've also seen through the pandemic, through the rise of things like OnlyFans, other virtual platforms, is like this influx of not only sex workers that did in-person work now transitioning online, but people outside of sex work altogether, right? Even celebrities kind of like turning to these platforms and using a lot of like the sex worker language, aesthetic, like the look and terminology and stuff like that, but not being penalized in the same way. And so as that happens, you know, as platforms like social media platforms, adult content platforms start to see like the more mainstreaming of their work and stuff, they start to crack down on sex workers more. So inevitably there will be a lot of changes as people are shadow banned and kicked off, and you know, our communities adapt and like we're very resilient, but there are certainly some conditions that are changing very rapidly. At a high level, like the city can kind of come in and say that clubs have engaged in like bylaw infractions. They can ticket, they can fine, they can send bylaw enforcement officers in. They actually recently developed like a specific branch of the bylaw enforcement division that only works with like adult entertainment venues. So it's very targeted policing on top of sending Toronto police into these spaces, which for a lot of sex workers can be incredibly traumatizing and a complete nightmare to have to face off like that. And I think that alongside like a lot of the stigma that like Mayor Tory, like Premier Ford, like they're fanning those things when they say that like strip clubs are dirty, they're public health threats, like who are the clients, why do they go here, how could they tell their wives? Like they kind of fan the flames of this like moral panic that then like when that works at the same time as like these bylaw regulations and policing in these clubs, like obviously creates conditions where like for a lot of people it's not safe for others in your life to know that you're a stripper, because of like how society stigmatizes sex workers and how political leaders allow that. So I think my biggest worry in terms of reopening and returning to work is the ability of dancers to be able to advocate for reopening guidelines that fit their specific needs, right? Like the perspective of a dancer working in a club, in a VIP room, and the kinds of needs and considerations you need around public health, very different from what club owners and managers are able to identify just based off of experience. So for me, like I want to see club owners and managers, but also the city and the province and both divisions of public health at those levels consulting directly with sex workers, like directly with exotic dancers to be like, what does reopening in your workplace look like and what do you need to be able to work here safely? And sort of extend like those kinds of like labor rights, the ability to advocate on behalf of dancers like as workers in this city, I think is going to be really important. So there's that piece. And I think from the city and municipal licensing and standards, it's not right that people have had to pay hundreds of dollars for licenses that they have not been able to use for more than a year. Clubs have had to do the same thing. Their licensing fees are in excess of $10,000 as well, while not being able to operate for a year. And so our call for like industry-wide pandemic relief, like freezing those fees, reimbursing people that have had to pay for those, and forgiving people whose licenses had lapsed so they don't have to pay the full amount when they go back to get it, that call is still definitely on the table. And of course, like an apology from the mayor, an apology from the city, and a complete end to the kind of disgusting, degrading remarks about strippers, about clients, about clubs, and about us as workers altogether, because it makes it so much more dangerous. It makes it so much more difficult because it fans these flames of stigma and of moral panic as well. I think that's everything.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.